Hi and welcome. Thank you for joining me for this recording prior to our in-person session where I will be joining you next week. My name is Lita McDaniel. I'm a physical therapist and adjunct professor at Emory University in the Division of Physical Therapy. I teach in their graduate program for physical therapy. And I've been involved in teaching and education for the better part of 7 or 8 years now, starting with tutoring at the undergraduate level and moving into more of a formal teaching role as I've progressed. I'd like to talk to you today about leveraging learning science in your doctorate program, which is a doctorate of pharmacy education. And what I really want to get to is tips and ways that we can hopefully help you out with studying more effectively, but also more efficiently with your time. So learning objectives for today, we're just going to go through the first learning objective with this recorded lecture, and then we'll get to the other ones when we're meeting in person. But most of what I'd like to cover today, and thank you all for those of you who took the survey, that gives me a better sense for where we're starting, what your understanding is about learning science, but also where your study habits are, and having that baseline will really help out as we talk about effective learning and study strategies. And I want to spend more time on those things that maybe you're less familiar with or have more misunderstandings with, and not spend a lot of time on the things that you already are grasping pretty well. So the objective for today is for you to be able to identify common myths about effective learning and study strategies or learning errors, and start to think about how we might adapt your study habits to make them more efficient and effective. Because we know, as you've told me, some of the things that you're interested most in are, how do I retain large amounts of information in a short amount of time? How do I study for these various classes when I feel overwhelmed, or maybe have 3 different quizzes or tests in a single week? And so I really want to highlight things that will be most applicable within your program, and we'll get to more specific examples in person. But today, let's just kind of get a baseline foundational knowledge, and I hopefully will be piquing your interest on some things that maybe are not quite as you expected with how we learn today. So bear with me on that. And I do want to talk about some of your survey responses, because I think those were really good. So thanks again for those of you who took that. So flip for today, we're going to talk about learning myths. In person, I want to talk about 5 key learning science principles. So kind of distill some of the learning science literature and research base into these principles that you can apply hopefully right away in your program. I know some of you have read the book, Make It Stick, The Science of Successful Learning. I'm the daughter of one of the co-authors, so I do have unique kind of perspective there and interest in that book and some of the concepts that it talks about. But I also want to kind of simplify and pull out what are the things that are perhaps most relevant that we can, like I said, get you introducing or adapting into your study habits hopefully right away. I want to talk about practical applications, and then I do want to have time for questions and some interaction with you all in person. Looking forward to that. So the first thing I want to talk about is some of these myths, and to get us going on that, I pulled this quote out from the book, Make It Stick, and that is that learning really is an acquired skill. So I want you to think about learning as kind of a toolbox or a skill set that you're cultivating. So you don't have to learn or study the same way that you've always done, or that you're doing currently. You can change your study habits, and that can improve your ability to retain information. So that is quite cool. And we'll talk about that a little bit more towards the end, though it is a little bit scary to change some of the familiar habits and actions that you've always done. If rereading notes and textbook passages is something that you have spent a lot of time on, it might be intimidating or scary to change that habit, even though that might not be the most effective use of your time. So some of these things that I'm asking you to do might seem effortful, might seem counterintuitive, but what I'd like you to do is enter this with a little bit of curiosity and a little bit of an experimental mindset, like, hey, maybe I'll try this for a little bit and see about the outcome. And if Lita's wrong, I'll go back to my old study habits. So test me on these things. But again, some of these most effective strategies might not be the most intuitive, and they might be things that you are not already doing. So we have quite a bit of, that's where I get excited. You have quite a bit of room for you all, I think, to introduce some of these different strategies and really improve your learning. So again, I want to talk a little bit about the literature, but I want to get pretty quickly to what are you all doing as a class. So this is perhaps a benchmark study that we can look at to see what are some study strategies that most students are doing. And this is taken from a survey in an undergraduate class, psychology class at Washington University in St. Louis, where my father's a professor. What they found is that the majority of students engage in rereading notes or textbooks, so 84%. And then, as you can see, quite a bit fewer or lower numbers, lower percentage engage in study strategies that we're going to talk about that are maybe more effective. So practice problems, 43%. Mnemonics, only 14% of individuals are using those. I'm going to encourage you all to use mnemonics and memory tips and tricks. And we'll go through some of those. Quite a bit less engage in self-testing or self-quizzing. It's only about 11% in this survey. And that is one of the study strategies that I'm really, really going to recommend you start to engage in most of your classes in any way possible, because of its ability to improve long-term retention and also improve understanding of maybe what your knowledge base is, what you know, and where you're still kind of falling short. If you're engaging in self-quizzing, self-testing, your judgments of what you know are going to be a lot more accurate. So as I was mentioning, high percentage of individuals in this sample reread notes. And interesting to know that over half, 55%, rate that study strategy, rereading, as their first choice study activity. So number one. And like I said, fewer are doing these study strategies that are perhaps more effective. So we'll talk about that. So now here's the chance to compare what you all are doing as a class to that sample. So the orange is the study that I mentioned, that group of undergraduates, 177 of them, those individuals, and how they rated their engagement in these different study strategies. And as you can see, your class is in red. Those of you who answered the survey, thank you for that. So 54 of you. So a good percentage of your class. So I feel pretty comfortable saying that this is representative of your class's overall study habits. And I am really excited to see that overall you're engaging in already some of these things that are potentially more effective or helpful for you. So self-testing, about 75% of you are doing that. Flashcards, about 75%. That's one method of self-testing or quizzing. Mnemonics, about 2/3 of you all are using those. I would encourage the other third, all of you, to be engaging in some of those strategies that I mentioned. The other thing I want you to notice and take a second to digest is the percentage of you who are also using study strategies that are not as effective. So maybe you have a mix of study strategies you're employing. And again, I'm going to try to encourage you to keep the ones that are more evidence-based, or maybe introduce those into your habits. And really, one of the hard things I think as a student or as a learner to do is to ditch those habits or study strategies that are not as effective. So rereading, 3/4 of you all are still rereading. I'm going to highly recommend that decreases quite a bit, if not altogether. Highlighting, not as effective. About half of you all are doing that. Rewriting notes, not as effective. So those are sources where you could gain some efficiency in your study time and opportunity to maximize the study time you do have with these more effective strategies. This is another chance to look at what you are selecting as a class and what your number one preferred study strategy is, versus the sample that I mentioned. So only a few of you rate rereading as your number one strategy. That is excellent. About a quarter of you engaging in practice problems. That is excellent. Self-testing, about a quarter of you. That's great. So we want to move your number one strategy or your first choice in strategy towards these more evidence-based strategies. So why is there a tendency? I know I'm pretty quickly emphasizing this finding that rereading in the literature is not very effective. So you're kind of getting the sense for my recommendation that you don't reread, but why might you be attracted to using that as a strategy, and why, in fact, do most students engage in that as a strategy? So some people believe that, or some learners believe, if they're going over and over their notes or information, that those repetitions will improve their remembering or their learning of the material. Rereading also creates kind of an error in judgment, and these terms in the research base are called fluency and familiarity. So if you read something once, it's novel. If you read it again, then it seems more familiar. And in fact, the act of rereading seems more fluid, it's self-reinforcing, and that kind of tricks you into thinking that you're remembering or you're learning, when in fact, what we find is that long-term retention is not improved by rereading. So I'm sorry, spoiler alert, I already said it, I already jumped the gun, but does rereading actually help with test performance? So this is another experiment that's been done with, again, psychology students, and the orange versus the red are those that read a passage single time or twice, and then they were asked to take a multiple choice test. So did those that read twice actually perform any better? And what we find is that, I'm sorry, the error bars are not there. Those orange and red bars are, to our knowledge or for our purposes, identical. There's no significant difference whether you read once or you read twice on multiple choice quizzing for these different types of course information. So abnormal psychology versus biopsych. And another experiment in the same lab, what they were looking at was performance on short answer questions. So you might think, well, okay, multiple choice, the rereading might not improve that, but if they're tasked to actually answer and write out an answer, those that read twice, of course, you would think that they would improve their ability to answer those short answer questions. And what we find is that that's not actually the case. So that second rereading you can think of as almost wasted time. And this kind of emphasizes the point that I've been hopefully hammering home, that second reading of the text is not necessarily improving your learning. And it's quite a bit of inefficient time spent if you have limited study time. Okay, so here are the 5 common learning errors that I would like to highlight. We've already talked a lot about number 2, that rereading is an effective learning strategy. So that's an error, that's a myth. Number 1, what we find is that students don't necessarily intuitively know which strategies are best. So we'll talk about that. The idea that people make accurate judgments of knowing or knowing what you know. So a metacognitive evaluation of your learning. We find that it's not necessarily true. Errors are bad for learning. Majority of you all got this on the pre-quiz, so that's excellent. We know that part of the learning process is to make small errors, and the correction of those errors actually enhances learning. Number 5, I'm going to wait and talk about with the examples that I have, because this is one that is pretty common colloquially, but actually is a myth. So learning styles, matching learning styles doesn't necessarily help with learning. So we'll talk about that. So myths 1 and 2, with those laboratory studies that I mentioned and went through in comparison with your class, we find is that students don't necessarily know which strategies are best. So we talked about that. And rereading is not an effective learning strategy. So those are just two experiments with data that support those ideas, but there's much more research based behind those. I'm just choosing to select certain studies so we don't get bogged down in the research, so we can talk about more implementation. The next learning myth or learning error is that people make accurate judgments of knowing. And what we find in the research base, these are some citations that corroborate this, is that individuals actually have poor judgments for knowing. Part of this is that the study strategies that they might engage in actually reinforce those errors or false senses of knowing. And one of the practices that does this is rereading, as I mentioned, that creates fluency or familiarity. That's actually a false judgment. Individuals tend to engage in less self-testing or self-quizzing. And as I mentioned, that actually produces more of an accurate judgment of knowing. So I would encourage you to use that study strategy, not only because it improves long-term retention, but like I said, it's going to give you a better sense for what you know and what you don't know. So it's not going to provide poor judgment of knowing, or sometimes we refer to this as an illusion of competence. So I think I know that, but actually don't. That's pretty harmful when you start selecting then what material to study, because you already think you know a certain area of information. So you're not as likely to go through that. And in fact, you don't, and that can lead to poor test performance. It can lead to poor long-term retention and lead to poor learning. So just as I was mentioning, many students, and this is taken from this research study, and I want to highlight this example and just let you think about this for a second, is that many students experience these illusions of confidence while studying. And these illusions, or this false sense of knowing, it has significant consequences for the strategies they select when they're monitoring and regulating their own learning. So when you're choosing the strategies that you want to engage in, I want you to come back to these research-based strategies, and I want you to do a mini experiment with yourself. Give them a try, even if they don't at first feel so good or so familiar. What we find is that they will become a little bit easier, but what we also find is that they need to be a little bit hard so that they stimulate that adaptation that we're going for, which is long-term retention. So just as I was alluding to, we really want in our effective learning setups, environments, study strategies, what's called desirable difficulty. So the analogy I like to use, and bear with me, I'm a physical therapist, I have a lot of analogies that come back to physical training, exercise, but I think you all hopefully can relate to some of these, and they help make these concepts a bit more tangible. So desirable difficulty was a term that was coined by Bjork, and he is a very famous researcher, psychologist within learning science. And he talked about the idea that in effective learning setups and environments, the practice and the act of studying in these environments is difficult. And we want just enough difficulty, like I said, to drive that positive adaptation that we're going for in learning setups. Our positive adaptation is long-term retention and learning. The analogy I like to use is if you go to the gym and you're trying to get stronger and you're engaging in strength training. So you're doing some sort of weightlifting, let's say squats, you want stronger leg muscles. The weight that you use for your squats has to be appropriately challenging. And what we find, this is kind of nerdy, but in the PT literature and the strength training literature, we want you to train at least 60% of your one repetition maximum. So put 60% or higher on that barbell, engage in some sets and reps of strength training, and those things have been studied as well. So we could talk about numbers, but I don't want to get too far into that. The idea is you have to have a weight that is heavy enough that it challenges your muscles appropriately enough, and that difficulty or that stress is going to drive the adaptation that you want, in this case, stronger leg muscles. Learning is a similar scenario. You want the setup to be somewhat difficult So I want you to think about that when you're engaging in studying and it's a little bit hard. I want you to celebrate that moment, because likely you're engaging in something that is going to drive a positive adaptation that you want, even if it doesn't feel so good in the moment. So what we want to think about is that I want you to really get a sense for, what does performance look like versus learning? And the distinction I'm trying to make is, what is your short-term performance versus what is your lasting effect from your study strategy or long-term retention and learning? And those things oftentimes are quite different. So performance in the short term, taking an immediate recall test or rereading, your ability to perform feels easy, it feels fluent. Sometimes it feels like you're remembering or getting it. And this short-term performance does not reward forgetting or error. So if you make an error immediately, that doesn't necessarily feel good, or you feel like you're not performing so well. However, these small errors are what drive long-term adaptive changes, which is your retention, your learning, and it might feel quite effortful or difficult. The last myth that I want to talk about, and thanks for bearing with me through that introductory material, but just looking at some of the responses to these questions, I felt like it would be helpful to go through all of these myths, given that some of you, and in fact, about half of you rated, and I should have brought this up earlier, but about half of you rated that students are intuitively going to know the best study strategies. And as I've mentioned, that's not necessarily the case. And as even your classes data show, there's still a large percentage of you engaging in study habits that might not be as effective. I'm really excited that more of you are choosing effective study strategies than that sample that I presented. This last learning style error, or learning error or learning myth is, like I said, the one that tripped the majority of you up. So 85% of your class view learning styles and a matched delivery, meaning a teacher or an instructor who matches their delivery style with your preferred learning style, that condition could improve learning. In fact, that's not the case. So different surveys will ask different questions, but the upshot is, and I'm sure you all are familiar with this, is they're going to try to gauge whether you are a visual learner, you like seeing things, are you an auditory learner, you like new information presented to you verbally so that you can listen to it. Kinesthetic learners tend to like or prefer hands-on, but does that preference actually matter when it comes to how your instructor delivers information? This is another survey or quiz of learning styles. So you take the online test, it spits out the percentage that you are for each of these different things. And it tends to, or it tries to give you your learning style or your type to improve memory, learning, education. Problem with this is, and this is a really well done, eloquent, systematic review. If you want to dig into the nitty-gritty of the research, I would recommend that you check this out. But the upshot of this review was that there actually is no evidence to justify incorporating learning styles assessment into general education practice. And the greater finding is actually that there is not sufficient evidence to support the what we call meshing hypothesis, or the idea that matched delivery with learning style improves long-term retention or learning. So if you think that you're a kinesthetic learner, you like hands-on, and your teacher is instructing in a hands-on manner, that doesn't actually improve your learning or your retention of the information. If they instruct you in a visual manner and you are a kinesthetic learner, it does not impede your learning to any degree. So again, I like analogies. My analogy with learning styles is that, yes, you might have a preference for how you like to learn, not debating that. You might like eating ice cream. You might like chocolate ice cream. That might be your preference. I love chocolate ice cream. So if you want to butter me up, that's the flavor I like, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that's good for me. So I might like the kinesthetic way of learning something, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that's going to help me learn better. Might like visual learning. Doesn't mean that if my instructor puts things up on the board for me to see, that I'm going to be any better learning or retaining that information. So seems counterintuitive to those of us who maybe have heard about learning styles in just colloquial settings, even in educational settings. This is a common misunderstanding. But I promise you, there's a lot of evidence that we don't see better learning with matched learning styles. Last thing I want to get to is effectiveness versus efficiency. So effective strategies are those that are going to improve learning, long-term retention. We've talked a little bit about effective strategies, but our in-person session, what I want to do is highlight those to a greater degree. And I want to remind you that some of those effective strategies, if you're engaging in those study habits, you might sacrifice your short-term performance. They might be more effortful. They might feel more difficult, and they might not actually be intuitive or the ones that you choose first. So some of the selection of study strategies that I'll encourage, again, I'd like you to think of it as an experiment or a trial and see how you do. Efficiency, this has to do with how you're using your time. And what I'd encourage you to do is increase the use of some of these evidence-based strategies and with equal importance, reduce the use of strategies that don't have evidence-based. I'd also encourage you to regularly check your progress or understanding with some sort of self-quizzing and self-testing, not only because that is a strategy that we've seen in the research base improves long-term retention, but it actually will give you a better sense for what you know and what you don't know. Finally, I'd like to encourage you to be open to changing some of your strategies. I think I've said this in a lot of different ways, but please keep an open mind. I think that's why you're listening, and that's why your instructors find this content to be so important, is that there is the opportunity for you to change habits and really improve some of your learning and understanding of the material. So I'd like you to get to using some more effective strategies and self-evaluation of your own study strategies. So I've talked about some of your class's preferences, but this is your chance to really look at your own individual habits. And as I've talked about a couple times here now, engage in some of these more effective strategies, reduce the use of some of these less effective strategies. And that gets to our discussion of efficiency as well. So again, I'd like to reiterate, stopping those ineffective study habits just as important as engaging in the effective ones. So please stop rereading. I encourage you to spend more time on these more helpful strategies. Some potential reasons to change your study habits. And this is kind of where I will leave you until we meet in person. So if you have poor test performance, it might be a good chance to engage in some different ways of studying and trying to learn. If you find yourself with really good performance in the short term, maybe even good performance in a class, but you're finding yourself not retaining information from prior courses, that might be a reason to change some of your study habits. If you find yourself having these poor judgments of knowing or illusions of competence, so going into a test thinking, I really studied hard, I know this material, and then getting a poor grade on a test, that disconnect might be a reason to change your study habits to those that encourage a more accurate judgment of knowing for you. There may be others. These are just a few that I thought I would highlight. And again, would encourage you to really self-evaluate to a great degree and be selfish. Which of these reasons potentially rings true for you? And what do you want to get out of this presentation of study habits? I would encourage you to come with questions or ideas. I'm happy to answer as many as I can during the lecture. I'm also happy to give you my contact information. It will be in my materials. for you to contact me after the fact. I love thinking and talking about these kinds of things. I hope that that comes across. I'm very passionate about this topic, so I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have, either in person or after the fact. Thanks for your attention, and I look forward to working with you in class.